Hello. I'm a little bit nervous. This is my first time presenting at a B-Sides. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you. So this whole talk is about a side project that I've been running for the last, 6 months or so. So I have more of a traditional background when it comes to, security operations and incident response as an analyst. And I moved into a security engineering role at a company last year that's very cloud focused. So it's been an area that I've been focusing on improving internally, and it's something that's really interested me quite a bit. So that kind of led me to be interested in S3 and Amazon. The problem, I don't think anyone in this theater really has any illusions as to the fact that 2017 was a terrible year for people that host S3 buckets. In particular, Deep Root Analytics, that the company that lost the entire, California voter rolls, as well as most recently a FedEx subsidiary, partner of Walmart. It felt like 2017 was pretty much like the year of the S3 incident. Though I think the general public would probably remember it as the year that Equifax happened. But we'll see. And there's a real problem because, especially when you look at, say, the Deep Root Analytics breach, where they exposed all those California, data records and all the profiles that they had made on the California voters. The thing about it was, it wasn't technically illegal for them to have that data stored in a public S3 bucket. It's only illegal or based on how you use it. So it's illegal to use that data for certain purposes. But that company's still, up and running. I'm sure they're being sued, but technically they didn't actually even do anything illegal. All the really damage was to reputation. So AWS and Amazon in particular are very aware that this looks really bad. So they have, and I got to commend them on it. They've done an amazing job at providing resources and making changes to hopefully get in front of this issue. Because the funny thing about it is that AWS has by far and away the highest market share of almost 40% of the cloud market. And according to some security researchers, up to 7% of all buckets are public. So let that sink in for a second. And they've gone to great lengths to publish blog posts, articles, white papers, podcasts. They've sent automated emails to account owners letting them know they might want to take a look at that. They've rolled out a new tool called Macy, which helps you accidentally or prevent you from accidentally exposing data like PCI or credit card numbers, whatnot. They've made a number of UI UX changes, which you can actually see up on the screen. So they've now made big orange tags in their web console, so you can be pretty sure that you're doing something you're not supposed to be doing. And they've always defaulted to private. Let's not forget that. So all these public buckets are ones that were set that way specifically. And even most recently, just last month, or more than that now, but on February 20th, they made the S3 permission checker tool public for all users, where previously it was only available to enterprise users. So they're really trying to make the tools available to help their users. And they've also done a number of things in the background that you may not know about. So, for example, they also communicate directly with people that own S3 buckets that maybe they might not want to expose. So if you remember back to that previous slide before this one, you saw that I had a screenshot showing that I had 92 public buckets at that time when I took the screenshot. And I actually got this email about 4 months into the project. And someone, I think my current working theory is they reported me to them, and they couldn't really terminate the buckets because I guess I hadn't violated their terms of service. But they actually emailed me about these two in particular and letting me know that I may have exposed my S3 buckets to a larger audience than intended. Thank you. That was kind of the idea, but we'll go with it. So let's talk real briefly and real quickly, because I don't have a ton of time, about how you actually enumerate S3 buckets, as well as other types of cloud storage. And it's basically a case of trial and error for the most part. You come up with likely names for buckets, and then you make an HTTP request, and you see what they say back. And fairly standard web enumeration tools work. I've seen all kinds of standard off-the-shelf tools thrown against the Honeypot S3 buckets that I was running. But generically, you're going to take a word list, and start with like a word root. So you might start with, if I wanted to host buckets for myself, I would say Cameron, and then I would go through a word list and I would just append suffixes like the ones you see in front of you, and see if they exist or not. And standard word lists that are available, on GitHub work just fine. And specifically, you just look to see what response codes you get. If it's a 200, it exists. If it's a 404, it doesn't. And if it's a 403, it exists, but you can't access it. So there's not a lot of obfuscation here. It pretty much, right away if you found one or not. Anyone want to take a guess or want to contribute? So Amazon's not the only one in the file storage market. There's also, Azure from Microsoft and Google Cloud are also major players and looking to gain market share as quickly as they can. Anybody want to put a hand up saying that Google is maybe better at protecting their buckets than Amazon? Anybody? How about Microsoft? Microsoft's known for security, right? Well, funny thing about that. These are the API endpoints that you can actually enumerate to determine whether an S3 bucket or any sort of other similar file storage exists. And Microsoft actually took a somewhat different approach, and it's actually significantly more difficult to enumerate because they incorporate the account name. Not only do you have an Azure account, but you also have an associated storage account in Azure, from what I understand. So it's actually even more difficult, actually, because you have to enumerate two different things that you may or may not know. I'm not even entirely sure if it's possible. It's a good research project if anyone's interested. So let's get into the good stuff. As someone who was kind of learning a lot about AWS last year, specifically S3, it was an area of interest because of all the public breaches and the articles that were being posted. I wanted to know who is scanning, who is doing this, when are they doing it, how are they doing it, what kind of volume would I see? And I had the pretty simple idea of just throwing some up there and seeing who just tried to access them. So, I decided that I was going to create a bunch of buckets using public word lists. I was going to populate them with lures, and then I was just going to set up access logging and wait and see what happened. Ended up not doing a lot with the number 2 bullet. Ended up not populating these with lures like I had originally intended, because I wanted to start with a little bit more passive approach, and then maybe I would be more invasive moving forward. But that's basically the general idea, and this did not, bad picture. But anyway, the basic idea was set up a bunch of public buckets and have them feeding their access logs into a private bucket, and then have some sort of system post-processing and using those logs in some way, pushing to a Kinesis stream in my case. So, and I did this basically as an internal hackathon project. I kind of had the idea to do it, and it came along, and I was like, whatever, I'll sign up for that and do that in a day. So I created a pretty simple Python Boto tool, that creates the buckets, generates the names, sets up the logging, and sets up the ACLs as required. And in September of 2017, I created about 100 buckets, and they were themed on 16 different entities, which is kind of important. So as someone who was working for Okta at the time, I kind of decided that I wanted to make the buckets appear as if they belong to peers or similar companies to us. So they were mostly themed on tech companies in the Bay Area that shall not be named. But I decided I was also going to use a word list from the most popular Google search for S3 bucket enumeration. So at the very least, I figured I was going to catch people that knew how to Google. So that project was actually called Sandcastle, and it's since been removed or made private. But I ended up using that word list. So what happened? Well, within 10 hours, someone had hit one of the buckets that I just created. They were not referenced anywhere. They were not used anywhere. They had really nothing in them. But I saw access requests pretty much almost immediately by people. So they came from pretty much primarily the United States. Can I fix my, I think I have, let me not do that. Is that a little, I think that's a little bit better. So, primarily the United States, but over the 6-month period, I saw about 550 unique IP addresses make requests to the Honeypot S3 buckets. 50% from the United States, followed by the EU and as well as India were the main ones. And this kind of surprised me because when it came to people enumerating and scanning, web assets, From my day job, I was a little bit more associated that kind of activity a little bit more with Southeast Asia, Russia, China, South America, stuff like that. But this was mainly, from the United States, which I thought was kind of interesting. Um, who? Who was doing this? This was a big question that I had, and I was kind of surprised by what happened. Oh, almost 40% of all the requests that were sent to my Honeypot S3 buckets had an associated IAM login. So that included an IAM username in plain text as well as an account ID, which really kind of threw me at first, because if you're going to be scanning these buckets that probably don't belong to you, you're logging into them. They're not, not invited. They weren't in scope for any sort of bug bounties. They weren't in use anywhere. But the reason why my theory is that AWS heavily rate limits you if you don't include IAM creds. So if you're trying to do any sort of enumeration at scale, that rate limit would be a serious issue. So that's, I think, why it was also set up like that. And I have another theory, and that's because, and I'll follow up with this a little bit later on in the presentation, but most of the enumeration was done using legitimate AWS tools like the SDKs and the command line interface, which will automatically load profiles from the system. If you are on a system that is configured to have IAM creds or a profile, it'll load it and send it along with your requests. And maybe there was some unintentional exposure there. But I saw a total of 34 unique IAM users. And I did look to see if any of these users were distributing their scanning across multiple IPs, and I didn't see that at all. In fact, pretty much all of the IAM users that I saw were associated with a single IP address over a 6-month period. But that's also kind of an interesting point, is because so many of these were authenticated, you could easily track a particular actor across multiple hosts if they were attempting to distribute it. And I usually saw these users fall into one of two groups. Usually there was like some sort of Twitter, GitHub, HackerOne alias, or it was clearly a tool. So I saw a lot of automated tools. I wonder what S3 checker is for an IAM user. People are programmatically, going after buckets. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So what kind of tempo did we see? How often were my buckets being hit? So I'm going to immediately discount that top chart, and I filtered it out and got the bottom chart. That was just one guy that just decided to slam one of my buckets with an automated tool, totally skewing all my results, which was something I had to take into account pretty much the entire time. But on average, I saw, on average, 200 requests to my honeypot buckets a daily, with a median of 40 to account for spikes. So, and on average, 13 of the honeypot buckets were touched every day. So that's a pretty high number. I think 13 out of 100, almost 10% were found on average every day. So the people that were going after these buckets were pretty aggressive, and they're also pretty good at it. And I'll talk a little bit more about the two spikes on the bottom one as a case study later on. So what were they using? From a scripting perspective, I mostly saw Golang, Ruby, and Python. And it could also be, like I said, I have to take into account spikes and traffic, but I think the Golang guy might actually have just been a single person who was very prolific, or was just making a lot of requests. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I saw a lot of the AWS command line tools, as well as SDKs, Boto SDKs, as well as curl, S3 browser, whatnot. But another thing that surprised me was people were hitting these with pretty much standard tools like Burp Collaborator and OWASP Dirtbuster. I don't know why. Mainly, I think because they could. I mean, you can point those tools at a generic URL that S3 offers by the web. But the thing that I was mainly interested in seeing were the custom S3 bucket enumeration tools. So these are the more sophisticated guys who are deploying their own tools that will aggressively recon these buckets and go a little bit beyond what your off-the-shelf vulnerability scanners are going to go for. I'll talk briefly about targeting, and I think this is a pretty interesting and sobering slide. But of the IPs that I saw, almost a third targeted a bucket belonging to more than one entity. Entity meaning company A, company B. So these guys were, targeting multiple organizations pretty regularly, and over half were able to access or locate more than one S3 bucket honeypot. So I think this could be the fact that they were using the word list approach. to enumerate, and probably they just happened to find a lot of mine because I was using similar word lists. And then how many of those guys actually downloaded content from the bucket that they didn't own or didn't belong to, or it wasn't in scope for anything or in use for really anything? Well, a third of them downloaded content once they found the bucket. So the actors that are after S3 buckets are targeting a number of entities, and they're very good at hunting down buckets that exist and are easily enumeratable by a word list. And a third of them are actually accessing the data, which actually seems a bit low to me, because if you're going to go through the trouble of hunting it down, don't you want to know what's in it? So as I mentioned before, the thing that kind of interests me the most were the custom tools that people were rolling to actually figure out some more intensive reconnaissance of what the buckets could actually be used for. And I think that these guys were interesting because they went beyond just bucket exists and it's got files in it. They were looking at things like, can I change the logging policy? Can I change the bucket policy? Can I modify the ACLs of these buckets? Actions that I would more associate with takeover than recon. And following along with that, this was actually a question that came from a previous presentation of this topic. Someone after the talk asked me, were all the attackers kind of the same? Were there some that were more effective or dangerous than others? Could you rank them by severity? And I thought that was a really cool idea. So I tried to do that. So I basically said that if you hit large numbers of S3 endpoints, or API endpoints that is, that would indicate a higher degree of sophistication. So standard scanners are mostly just going to look at the objects and the buckets themselves. The more sophisticated actors are going to start looking at things like ACLs, logging settings, if they're tagged, bucket policies, etc. And I found that 13% of the IPs that I saw interact with these honeypot buckets fell into this category. So over almost 10% of them did a much more intensive interrogation of the buckets when they found them. And another question that I would then ask myself is, okay, these guys are clearly more sophisticated. Are they better at hunting down these buckets? And I found that was also true. So on average, these 13% touched double the number of honeypot buckets than the rest of the people that were doing it. So I would say, yeah, they were more sophisticated. They were using custom tools, and they were much better at finding buckets, and they were finding a lot more of them. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So here's that example that I was telling you about before. So the where the one of the volume chart where I filtered out the guy on top, and the one on the bottom, there were still two clearly visible spikes. So looking at the tooling that the attackers or researchers were using, you can see a little bit of what was going on here. So this was, I think, one of the more sophisticated attackers, and he managed to hunt down 3 buckets belonging to 2 different organizations over about a 2-week period that he was active. And I think one of the things that kind of sets him apart is not only did he hit the buckets with standard, recon tools. You can see the looking at, seeing for exposed Etsy password and running all kinds of weird stuff against it. But you can also see that he was running the Boto 3 library. And I think also of interest here is the second row. Anybody know what Phantom.js is? Yeah, so Phantom.js is a tool that allows you to take screenshots of web pages. So not only was he scanning down the bucket, he was looking at all the contents of that bucket. He was taking screenshots of everything that he was doing. He was interrogating the buckets to determine if he could push policies or change logging status. And for good measure, he was just scanning it down with, I think, what I believe was the Arachni scanner, but I'm not entirely sure about that. Just a guess. And you can also see the volume count, very consistent. So if you look at, sorry, actually, I'll skip one slide ahead for just to highlight the consistency of his methodology. So on February 7th, he managed to find 2 of these buckets and issued about 400 requests exactly to each one. They were completely identical. And then he came back 2 weeks later and actually had slightly modified his methodology a bit. Maybe, he decided to go to V2 of whatever tool he was using, maybe change it up a little bit, but he also halved his footprint. He was only sending 200 requests to each of the buckets. And he may have changed his word list or his discovery methodology because he found an additional bucket when he came back 2 weeks later. And just to highlight what I mean by like a more intensive interrogation of the honeypot buckets, he was going way beyond just, oh, there's objects in it and I can read it. Look at some of the things he was trying, from put life cycles, changing logging status, adding notifications, seeing if he could upload, seeing if he could add tags, even seeing if he could host a website in that S3 bucket. So this is, I think, what I was associating with my more sophisticated attackers. And again, you can see the consistency in the volume. So clearly an automated tool. And by the way, this guy made really no attempts to hide himself. He's a British researcher, a bug bounty hunter, actually. And he has very interesting GitHub. He has pretty much no regard for hiding what he's doing. In fact, he actually uploads to a public GitHub repo his vuln scans of all the bug bounties that he's in. So if you've ever wanted to know if someone was vulnerable to something in the past and maybe they patched it, you can look at his historical scans, which is kind of interesting. Some of the key takeaways here, I think it's very easy to hunt down these buckets. There's no real protections in place. They're either public or they're not, or they don't exist. Again, something that surprised me was a heavy use of legitimate AWS tools, which make it pretty trivial to, figure out what you can do. And the other thing is I'm going to go out and make a theory that most of the people were researchers. And I say this because of the locations, primarily in the United States and the EU. A lot of them, almost half of them, were passing IAM users and account IDs with their requests. They weren't really making much of an attempt to mask themselves, as well as the volume. A lot of it was very targeted. And like I said, on a median day, there were 40 requests to about 13 buckets, so pretty targeted in the most case. And again, large numbers of the actors, almost half of them were able to find more than one bucket, and almost I think a third of them were able to find buckets belonging to more than one organization. So these guys are doing it in a pretty organized fashion. So I guess I'll kind of I'm a blue team member, right? I'm a security engineer. Is this something that I think was valuable? Would I recommend that other security engineers do it? Well, I think yes, because it's so easy. You literally just turn on a bucket, set up access logging, and wait and see what happens. And all you got to do is post a Lambda that processes the data. And I'm actually going to call out canarytokens.org. Anybody heard of those guys? They're really good, and you should check them out. And they, within the last 6 months, added S3 canaries as an option for their free virtual canary service or canary token service. They didn't have that when I started my project, but if you were looking to deploy one, it's pretty trivial. You just give them some creds and click go. And if you didn't want to give them creds, you can just make it. And as far as the value of it to a blue team member, I mean, companies throw a lot of money at threat intel. You could drop 6 figures on a threat feed, right? But this stuff is giving you real-time threat intel on actors that are actively targeting your web assets and cloud assets that may belong to you or you may be using. I mean, that's, I think, pretty slam dunk, especially given the cost, basically free. And another thing that's great is access logs. If you've ever looked at them, are basically like Apache web server logs. So they have IP addresses, user agents, what they tried to do, as well as enriched with the IAM information and account IDs. So you can very easily pivot into things like CloudTrail, app logs, as well as your IDS systems. And I'm also going to plug, there was a talk next door, actually before mine, about leveraging your bug bounties or data-driven bug bounties. And one of the other things that I think is very interesting about this is we operate a public bug bounty where we give all of our researchers their own Okta instance to play with. And it has an interesting, I think, source of information if they're hitting your Honeypot S3 buckets themed on your organization, and they're also interacting with your your dev tenants where your bug bounty researchers operate. You can actually get some interesting insight into how they operate, what they go after first, what kind of tools they're using, other than the S3 bucket stuff. What other targets are they going after? And I think like I said, it's cheap. The IOCs are readily applicable to your organization, and they're very easy to operationalize and feed into other systems. I think at that point I'll open the questions. Any questions? Oh, up there?
Did you ever have any buckets that allowed put bucket policy in? Did you see anything interesting in bucket?
So no, I didn't. But that's actually, I guess to kind of add on to this. So this was, like I said, a hackathon project that I put together in about 6 hours on like a Tuesday or whatever. And I didn't put a lot of effort into it at the beginning. And it was only about a month or two after I had done this that I started to look at the data. And I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. It might be a good research project. I think as I move towards the next version of these honeypots, I want to make them a little bit more interactive. Like I said, I didn't really go to great lengths to disguise them or populate them with like interesting looking lures. I think that if I were to do this again, and I plan on actually tearing them down, I would like to give the researchers the ability to upload data. So like going back to our friend, the British researcher, the bug bounty guy, let's go back a couple slides. So this guy tried to put a website onto my S3 bucket, and I'm really curious what that website was. So not only would I like to add in the next generation the ability for them to upload objects, I'd also like to have them have the ability to modify bucket policy and put websites and look at the lifecycle data, and because I'm kind of curious what they would have done if it would have been open. So I have kind of an initial rough idea that I want to have kind of a baseline, kind of known good bucket kind of setting. And then when I see people, put a website or put an ACL or put a bucket policy, save it off somewhere, and then restore it to that known good state, after like 30 seconds or something. So that would allow me to get those really cool indicators and get a little bit better idea of what they would have done after that. But in this initial version, it was pretty passive and only allowed read. Anybody else?
Yeah. Any sense of, so you mentioned basically brute force attempts with like word lists. Any sense that people are also using the sophisticated transparency logs to? Absolutely.
So the researcher that we mentioned actually has a number of GitHub projects that are powered by the transparency and CertStream in particular. So this guy, I looked into a lot of what he was doing just because I happened to find him because he was really noisy on those two occasions. But he basically ingests the CertStream using the open source transparency data on SSL certs. And he hunts through those and looks for any that are associated with people that are known to have open bug bounties. And then if he finds them, he scans them. Now, I wasn't able to find the exact tool that he was using against these. I think that he still has that as private. But several of his other tools fed off of the transparency project. Like, for example, if he happened to find one that was associated with a domain that was associated with someone that had a bug bounty, he would immediately do an Aquatone scan, which is a really cool tool. I don't know if you guys have I hadn't heard about it until I saw this guy use it, but it's a very good tool for scanning down subdomains as well as identifying domain takeovers. So he would immediately scan for domain takeovers if that was the case. And part of that domain takeover is also looking for S3 and CloudFront instances that are open for basically being taken. For example, if you host your website on, bsides.s3.amazon AWS and you delete that bucket, but you keep the DNS record, someone else can go along and register that, and then they have basically control over your domain. So I think I'm out of time, but thank you.
Thank you, Cameron.